Let yourself sink into the quiet for a moment. Tonight, I want to take you into the hidden corners of history. We often think of kings and emperors as noble figures draped in gold. But what happens when that power is corrupted? When the crown becomes a mask for cruelty, perversion, and fear? Imagine a ruler who invited young women to his castle, not for courtship, but to bleed them dry in rituals of vanity. Another who, convinced that his subjects were plotting against him, unleashed horsemen through frozen streets, dragging thousands into rivers of ice. And picture an emperor who turned his palace into a private carnival. Leopards leaping through golden hoops, courtesans trained like actors. One would turn murder into theater, watching his victims tortured in ways too grotesque for ordinary criminals. Another would gorge himself in orgies of food and flesh, even as his empire starved. There were monarchs who forced wives, daughters, and nobles into beds they could not escape, and rulers who hunted men for sport, loosing hounds on their prey as though human lives were no different from game. What makes these figures unforgettable is not only the cruelty they inflicted, but the scale of it. Their palaces dripping with silk and blood, their names carved into history with the same hand that signed death warrants. Were these monsters born of evil, or did the crown itself twist them into something inhuman? Tonight, we descend into the shadows of history, face to face with the most perverse and malevolent kings the world has ever known. Our first stop takes us to Portugal, mid-14th century. King Pedro I, known by some as the Just, was anything but ordinary in love. He fell for Inés de Castro, the lady-in-waiting to his wife. She wasn't just beautiful, she was ambitious, politically connected, and dangerous for the stability of the kingdom. When Pedro's wife died, he wanted to marry Inés. His father, King Afonso IV, saw her as a threat. One afternoon in January 1355, while Pedro was away, assassins entered the gardens where Inés sat with her young children. The blades fell quickly, leaving her lifeless among the roses. Most kings would have mourned in private. Pedro did not. When he took the throne 2 years later, he ordered Inés's body exhumed. Witnesses wrote that her skin had darkened, her lips stiffened, but Pedro dressed her in a velvet gown, placed a crown on her head, and sat her on the throne beside him. Then came the command. Every noble in court was to approach, kneel, and kiss her hand as they would any queen. Some did it trembling, some tried to hold their breath, and some claimed the stench of the grave lingered in the throne room for days. Historians still debate why he did it. Was it love, obsession, or revenge against those who had defied him? But one thing is certain, Pedro. I sent a clear message. In his court, even death could not strip someone of their crown. And this is just the beginning. For Inés, he built tombs of white marble in the monastery of Alcobaça, intricately carved, their lids depicting the lovers in eternal repose. They were placed facing each other, so that on the day of judgment, Pedro said, "She will awaken and be the first thing I see." Legends whispered that her final journey to the monastery was macabre. The coffin paraded through Coimbra, open for all to see their dead queen. Some claimed the sight haunted the city for generations, and perhaps most audacious of all, Pedro rewrote history itself, declaring that he and Inés had secretly wed before her death. With that, their children became legitimate heirs to the throne, whether the nobles liked it or not. When he first ascended the throne in 1547, Ivan was barely 17, but he moved with the confidence of a man destined for greatness. He crowned himself the Tsar of all Russia, the first ruler to take that title, and even seemed determined to reform his realm. He created a new legal code, strengthened the army, and invited foreign craftsmen to modernize the state. But power without trust is a dangerous mix. The death of his beloved wife, Anastasia Romanovna, in 1560, believed by Ivan to be another poisoning at the hands of the boyars, was the turning point. The grief curdled into paranoia. The reforms slowed, then twisted into a reign of calculated terror. In 1565, Ivan split Russia into two realms, the regular state and his personal domain, the Oprichnina. This was not just a political move. It was the creation of a personal empire where his will was absolute. His oprichniki, black-clad horsemen carrying severed dogs' heads and brooms, became the embodiment of fear. The dog's head signified their loyalty to sniff out treachery, the broom to sweep it away. They didn't just arrest traitors. They slaughtered entire towns suspected of disloyalty, burned villages to the ground, and executed nobles in elaborate public displays meant to terrify anyone who dared defy the Tsar. One infamous act, the massacre of Novgorod in 1570. Convinced the city was conspiring with his enemies, Ivan ordered weeks of torture and executions. Thousands died, men, women, children. Some drowned in the icy Volkhov River under the watchful eyes of the oprichniki. After the initial wave of executions, the violence escalated into something closer to ritualized terror. Ivan's feared oprichniki, his personal guard dressed in black, combed through the city street by street, dragging families from their homes. The wealthy were accused of treason, merchants of conspiring with foreigners, even monks and priests of blessing rebellion. Entire households were wiped out in the name of loyalty to the Tsar. Methods of punishment were cruel and theatrical. Many were whipped or beaten in the town squares before being executed. Monasteries were ransacked, icons smashed, and clerics tortured. Some were burned alive or drowned in the icy waters of the Volkhov River. Chroniclers describe how victims were bound together, sometimes a husband to a wife, and hurled beneath the frozen current to die side by side. Others were forced to watch as their children were killed before their own execution. The massacre lasted for weeks, a slow suffocation of the city. Food stores were seized, houses looted, and survivors left starving. Estimates vary, but between 10 and 15,000 people perished. Some accounts claim even more. For Novgorod, once a proud, wealthy hub of trade and culture, the slaughter was a near-death blow. Its population, economy, and prestige were shattered. In the end, the massacre of Novgorod was not just an act of vengeance. It was a demonstration of power. Ivan intended to send a message that betrayal, even suspected, would be answered with merciless cruelty. The shadow of those weeks in 1570 lingered for generations, reinforcing his reputation as a ruler both feared and remembered as the Terrible. Ivan's private life was just as disturbing as his public one. His court became a theater of cruelty and excess. Accounts describe drunken feasts that would turn suddenly violent, jesters beaten to death for a misplaced joke, nobles humiliated before their families. Some chronicles suggest he kept a twisted sort of harem within the Kremlin, forcibly marrying and discarding multiple women in rapid succession, often under the pretense of finding a new Tsarina. Many were sent to convents, or simply vanished from the record. Even his religious piety took on a morbid edge. He commissioned beautiful churches, including St. Basil's Cathedral, but legend claims he blinded the architect to ensure nothing so magnificent could be built again. True or not, the story stuck because it felt so very Ivan. By the late 1570s, Ivan's mental and physical health were deteriorating. Paranoia was his constant companion. The death of his son in 1581, the infamous murder in the Kremlin, was both the climax and the collapse of his rule. With his heir gone, Russia was left vulnerable. When Ivan died in 1584, slumped over a chessboard, the country entered what would later be called the Time of Troubles, a period of famine, foreign invasion, and civil strife. His reign had expanded Russia's borders, but at the cost of its stability, its nobility, and, for many, their faith in the crown itself. Ivan IV remains a figure both fascinating and horrifying. He was capable of grand vision and breathtaking cruelty, of devout faith and unspeakable sin. His legacy is not just in the cathedrals and laws he left behind, but in the psychological scar he burned into Russia's memory. It's no wonder that centuries later, the very mention of Ivan the Terrible still summons an image of a ruler who could embrace you one moment and destroy you the next. Imagine walking into a palace where marble floors gleam under the flicker of 1,000 torches. The scent of incense, thick and heavy, clings to your clothes. Music drifts in from somewhere deep inside, soft and alluring. But beneath it, you hear muffled sobs. At the center of this glittering nightmare stands a young man in a flowing purple cloak, smiling faintly as he decides, right there, who will live and who will not. That man was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but history remembers him by a name that sounds almost harmless: Caligula. At first, Rome adored him. He was the grandson of Emperor Tiberius's adoptive son, the beloved child of the celebrated General Germanicus. The people imagined a golden age under his rule. But what began as the reign of a promising young prince soon twisted into a spectacle of cruelty, excess, and madness, unlike anything Rome had seen. Raised in military camps, Caligula learned early that power could be enforced with a single command, and that human life was a resource to be spent. His reign, however, would prove that he didn't just value power. He delighted in breaking people, in turning every relationship into a game of dominance. His banquets became infamous, not for the food, but for the performances of humiliation. Wine flowed like rivers. Imported roses blanketed the floors in carpets of petals. Gold and gemstones were scattered across the table as if they were breadcrumbs. And then came the cruelty. In the middle of these feasts, Caligula would choose the wives of senators, disappear with them behind a curtain, and return moments later, smiling, as their husbands sat frozen, unable to protest without risking their own lives. But the humiliation didn't end there. In the middle of theater performances, Caligula would suddenly point to a random audience member and order their execution, just to liven up the mood. In his world, death was part of the entertainment. Then there was his most bizarre obsession, his horse, Incitatus. This was no ordinary pet. Incitatus had a marble stable, an ivory manger, and a blanket woven from purple threads, the color of emperors. His bridle was studded with precious stones, and Caligula once promised to make him a consul of Rome. Some say it was a joke, but most historians believe it was deliberate mockery, a way to remind the Senate that even an animal could replace them in his favor. The young emperor also demanded to be worshipped as a living god. He built a bridge between his palace and the temple of Jupiter, so he could stroll directly into the temple as if he were divine himself. Priests were ordered to sacrifice animals in his name, and citizens were expected to bow before him. Those who didn't vanished. And when the sun set, the palace didn't sleep. Night after night, Caligula summoned the wives, sisters, even daughters of Rome's most powerful men to join his evening gatherings. Rumors claimed that he indulged in acts meant to degrade and shock, that the imperial chambers echoed with both laughter and weeping. Whether all of it is true or partly exaggerated, the effect was the same. Fear became the air Rome breathed. The cruelty didn't stop at humiliation. Caligula seemed to relish reminding Rome that he alone decided who lived and who died. He would invite senators to dine at his table, then casually remark that he could have them executed before the next course was served. Guests often laughed nervously, never certain if his words were jest or prophecy. He turned justice into theater. Trials became mockeries where verdicts were already decided. sometimes dictated by his own whim in the middle of the proceedings. A man's fortune, family, even his life could vanish with a gesture of the emperor's hand. To Caligula, the Senate and the courts were merely props on a stage where he was the sole actor. One trial in particular revealed the depth of his cruelty. A man once begged the emperor for mercy, hoping for his life to be spared. Caligula smiled, agreed that clemency would be granted, and then ordered the man executed on the spot, declaring that death itself was the favor. For him, justice was not about law or fairness, but about the thrill of watching hope turn to horror in an instant. Spectacle was his obsession. He ordered prisoners of war and even innocent citizens thrown into the arena when the supply of gladiators ran thin, delighting in blood that flowed not as punishment, but as entertainment. Stories spread of entire sections of the audience suddenly chosen to fight wild beasts, their screams swallowed by the roar of the crowd. His madness stretched beyond the city walls. In one infamous episode, Caligula commanded his legions to march to the sea and wage war against Neptune, god of the oceans. The soldiers dutifully struck the waves with their swords and collected seashells as plunder, trophies the emperor triumphantly declared as spoils of victory. And always, the empire paid the price. Vast sums from Rome's treasury were drained not for roads or defense, but for Caligula's private spectacles, lavish banquets where food was wasted, monumental statues of himself erected alongside the gods, and absurd projects like floating palaces on ships. For the common people, taxes rose while fear became their daily bread. By the final years of his rule, Caligula no longer bothered to hide his contempt for the Senate or the people. He would bankrupt treasuries for personal spectacles, demand new temples built in his honor, and stage gladiatorial games where the only certainty was that someone unexpected would die. But power like this always invites betrayal. Whispers spread among his own guards. Plans were drawn. And one winter morning in 41 CE, while walking down a corridor toward a theater performance, Caligula was suddenly surrounded by members of the Praetorian Guard. In moments, the most feared man in Rome lay bleeding on the marble floor. The city breathed again, but the shadow of his reign, the gold-drenched halls, the cruelty disguised as entertainment, the mockery of the empire's proudest institutions, remained carved into Rome's memory forever. He wasn't just a tyrant. He was proof that the most dangerous rulers aren't always the ones who seek to destroy their empires, but the ones who turn them into their personal stage. Some kings ruled through charisma, some through gold. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, ruled through pure, calculated terror, and he enjoyed every moment of it. Before he became the dark inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula, Vlad III, also known as Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, was a living nightmare in the 15th century. Born in 1431, he spent part of his youth as a hostage of the Ottoman Empire, where he witnessed torture, executions, and the ruthless games of power at court. It was a brutal education that shaped him into a man who saw mercy as weakness and cruelty as both a political tool and personal entertainment. When people think of Vlad, they think of impalement, and for good reason. His preferred method of execution involved driving a wooden stake through a victim's body, often through the rectum or vagina, and leaving them to die slowly over several hours, or even days. The process was so deliberate that Vlad ordered the stakes to be smooth and rounded at the tip so as not to cause instant death. The victim's agony was part of the show. But Vlad didn't just kill his enemies. He arranged them like decorations. Entire hillsides and fields were turned into forests of impaled corpses. One infamous account describes the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II retreating from an invasion after encountering a field of over 20,000 impaled men, women, and children. It wasn't just a warning, it was an art installation of terror. One infamous tale involves the Ottoman envoys who visited Vlad's court. When they refused to remove their turbans in his presence, claiming it was their custom never to uncover their heads, Vlad praised their devotion to tradition and then ordered that the turbans be nailed to their skulls so they would never remove them again. Vlad's punishments also targeted crime within his realm. Accounts describe merchants accused of cheating customers being impaled alongside their scales, and wives accused of adultery executed in public squares. In one story, a woman's body was left on display with her husband forced to stand by, a brutal warning of the price of dishonor. Perhaps the most famous spectacle was the so-called Forest of the Impaled. In 1462, when Sultan Mehmed II advanced with a massive Ottoman army, his forces encountered a gruesome sight outside Târgoviște. Thousands upon thousands of corpses impaled on stakes, stretching as far as the eye could see. Chroniclers claim the Sultan himself recoiled in horror, calling Vlad the Terrifying One and abandoning his campaign. What makes Vlad particularly disturbing is that some reports claim his choice of victims could be deeply personal and disturbingly intimate. There are chronicles suggesting that he sometimes selected prisoners, particularly attractive young men and women, for his private amusement before their execution. These audiences were not recorded in the dry language of politics, but in whispers about humiliation, sexual violence, and perverse displays of dominance. While historians debate the accuracy of every rumor, one thing is certain: Vlad's cruelty was never random. It was deliberate, methodical, and theatrical, designed to strip a person of dignity before life itself. Among the most unsettling stories is the so-called virginity test, attributed to Vlad. In an era where chastity was tied to family honor, Vlad allegedly ordered public inspections of women accused of promiscuity. The accused would be examined, often in humiliating and invasive ways, and if found guilty, executed by impalement. In some versions of the tale, these tests were less about justice and more about satisfying Vlad's twisted sense of spectacle. The humiliation was as much a punishment as the death that followed. To Vlad, fear wasn't just an emotion, it was a currency. He famously invited hundreds of boyars, noblemen, to a feast only to have them arrested during the meal. Many were executed on the spot. Others, along with their families, were forced into hard labor, marched to the Argeș Valley, and made to build his mountain fortress at Poenari. Few survived the ordeal. Even his sense of justice carried a cruel twist. Chroniclers tell of a golden cup placed at a public well in Târgoviște. No thief dared touch it, for they knew the punishment would be impalement. To many, this was proof that terror worked. Under Vlad's rule, crime nearly vanished. Yet, it came at the price of a society where fear was more powerful than law. There's a chilling efficiency in how he combined governance with sadism. For Vlad, these executions weren't just punishment. They were a public reminder that crossing him would mean a death that people would whisper about for years. Vlad's marriages were political, tools to secure alliances, but they were not without shadows. His first wife, believed to be a relative of King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, is said to have thrown herself from the walls of Poenari Castle to avoid capture during an Ottoman siege. The official story calls it an act of loyalty and despair. But some accounts suggest her life with Vlad was one of fear as much as love. His second wife, Justina Szilágyi, came from a powerful Hungarian family. Their union was strategic, but even in the political theater of marriage, Vlad's reputation for cruelty overshadowed any sense of romance. Legends, some perhaps exaggerated by his enemies, claimed that Vlad sometimes dined among the dying, placing his table near the rows of impaled victims so he could enjoy their screams while eating. Chroniclers from the era recorded that he would dip his bread into the blood of his enemies. Whether literally or as a symbolic boast, it's hard to say. But the fact that the image persists says much about how his contemporaries saw him. Not just as a cruel prince, but as a man who blurred the line between violence and pleasure. Even after his death in 1476, Vlad's legend grew. Parents in parts of Eastern Europe would invoke his name to frighten misbehaving children. And for centuries, the line between the real Vlad and the mythic Dracula blurred. The cruel prince became a supernatural monster in the public imagination. What makes Vlad's story so unsettling is that it forces us to confront a reality more frightening than fiction. Here was a man who didn't just kill to protect his throne. He killed because he relished the power it gave him over life, dignity, and fear itself. But while Vlad's cruelty was soaked in the blood of his enemies, our next kings, perversions, were hidden behind closed palace doors, until scandal ripped them wide open. His obsessions were not just about killing. They were about controlling the bodies and desires of everyone around him. From orgies to whispered rumors of forbidden liaisons, this monarch's private life makes even Vlad's bloody reign seem almost tame. The next king we are talking about tonight was a ruler so obsessed with his own image that he would burn an entire city just to rebuild it in his name. A man whose nights were filled with wild feasts, masked orgies, and performances where he was always the star, forcing Rome's nobility to watch him sing, act, and dance, no matter how much they wanted to leave. This was Nero, the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and perhaps the most infamous figure in Roman history. His reign was a collision of spectacle, cruelty, and pure self-indulgence. Nero wasn't born to rule. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, maneuvered him into power after the death of Emperor Claudius, a death many whispered was hastened by poison in a dish of mushrooms. By the time Nero took the throne at just 16, Rome was already wary of his mother's ambitions. But instead of reigning with restraint, Nero saw his new title as the ultimate stage. In the early years, he left the day-to-day politics to capable advisors like Seneca and Burrus. Under their guidance, the empire ran smoothly. But soon, his appetite for control and for attention began to consume him. Nero's private life was a theater of scandal. He took multiple wives, mistresses, and male lovers, sometimes all in the same week. Most shocking of all was his relationship with a freedman named Sporus, a young man who resembled Nero's late wife, Poppaea Sabina. Nero allegedly had Sporus castrated, dressed him in royal clothing, and held a public marriage ceremony, parading him as the Empress of Rome. The Roman elite, humiliated yet powerless, had to treat this twisted parody as legitimate. At his feasts, guests would recline on couches dripping in gold and silk, surrounded by musicians, acrobats, and dancers. The nights would dissolve into masked revelries where identities blurred and boundaries vanished. But these feasts were less invitation than command. No senator or noble dared refuse. Rejection could mean exile, ruin, or worse. The event that sealed Nero's place in infamy came in 64 AD, the Great Fire of Rome. Flames devoured much of the city, and while chaos raged, rumors spread that Nero himself had ordered the blaze. Some claimed he watched the city burn from a tower, singing verses about the fall of Troy, while Rome crumbled beneath him. Others said he simply saw an opportunity in the ashes. Whether or not he started the fire, Nero certainly took advantage of it. He seized vast tracts of the ruined city to build his Domus Aurea, the Golden House. A sprawling palace with halls gilded in gold leaf, jewel-encrusted walls, revolving dining rooms with ceilings that rained petals and perfumes, and even an artificial lake at its heart. One of its grand halls was so immense that contemporaries claimed it could rival temples. When the palace was completed, Nero is said to have remarked, "At last, I can begin to live like a human being." But the fire left thousands homeless. To shift blame, Nero accused the small, persecuted sect of Christians. Their punishments were spectacles of horror, some torn apart by dogs in the arena, others crucified, and many burned alive at night as human torches to illuminate Nero's private gardens. Guests at his parties would walk among the writhing flames, sipping wine while men, women, and children were reduced to ash. Nero's greatest obsession wasn't politics, conquest, or even pleasure. It was performance. He considered himself a gifted artist, forcing senators, generals, and foreign dignitaries to attend his recitals for hours on end. No one was allowed to leave, even if illness struck. Chroniclers tell of noble women giving birth in the theater rather than risk walking out during his endless singing. Some senators feigned fainting just to be carried out, only to be brought back in once revived. He competed in Greek athletic games, where, unsurprisingly, he always won. In one infamous chariot race, Nero was thrown from his vehicle and didn't even finish, yet the judges still awarded him first place. The games were not contests, but ceremonies of worship. Nero the singer, Nero the athlete, Nero the god. As his ego swelled, so did his paranoia. He had his own mother Agrippina murdered, first by attempting poison, then collapsing a ceiling on her, and finally sending assassins to stab her when she survived. He allegedly kicked Poppaea Sabina, his beloved wife, to death while she was pregnant in a fit of rage. His purges eliminated senators, generals, even poets whose popularity threatened to outshine him. Rome's ruling class lived in constant fear, never knowing if they would be applauded one evening and condemned the next. Meanwhile, the people groaned under crushing taxes to fund his extravagances. To supply his palaces with gold, Nero imposed levies on provinces already strained. Whole regions revolted under the weight of his demands. And still, he staged elaborate pageants where the empire's wealth was burned away in firework displays, fountains of wine, and theatrical reenactments of battles, sometimes fought with real prisoners condemned to die for his amusement. By 68 AD, rebellion was in the air. Galba, governor of Hispania, rose in defiance. The Senate, weary of humiliation, declared Nero a public enemy. Abandoned by his Praetorian Guard, his advisors, and even his slaves, Nero fled the city disguised, hiding in a villa on the outskirts of Rome. There, with his enemies closing in, he realized capture was inevitable. Desperate, he begged one of his companions to help him die. In the end, it was his secretary, Epaphroditus, who drove the blade home when Nero could not. His final words were almost theatrical, a curtain call for the emperor who lived as if the world were his stage. Quales artifex pereo? What an artist dies in me. Nero left behind no children, no dynasty, only ruins, scandal, and a city forever changed by his hunger for spectacle. Even centuries later, his name remains shorthand for decadent tyranny, a ruler who turned the empire into his personal stage and burned its future for applause. But behind the palace doors, a different story was unfolding, one that would plunge Denmark into scandal. In 1769, the king's physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee, became his closest confidant. Struensee was intelligent, persuasive, and progressive, qualities the young king seemed to admire. But their relationship went beyond politics. Struensee took control of Christian's schedule, shielding him from official duties and quietly taking on more power himself. And then came the most dangerous twist. Struensee began an affair with Queen Caroline Matilda. It was a risky game. Christian, often too distracted or disoriented to notice what was happening around him, seemed oblivious at first. But the truth was impossible to hide forever. The Queen and Struensee were seen riding together in the gardens, exchanging glances during royal dinners. Soon, Copenhagen was buzzing with whispers. The king's closest advisor was sleeping with his wife. Yet Christian's reaction was unexpected. Instead of punishing Struensee, he allowed the affair to continue, perhaps out of emotional dependence on his physician, or perhaps because part of him didn't care. In fact, during this period, Struensee essentially ruled Denmark, issuing reforms and reshaping laws while the king drifted further into his private pleasures. But power grabs in royal courts rarely end well. In 1772, conservative factions struck back. Struensee was arrested, charged with treason, and executed, his head displayed for all to see. Queen Caroline Matilda was exiled to Germany, never to see her children again. And Christian? He remained on the throne in name, but his grip on reality continued to fade. His later years were marked by isolation. The once restless king now spent hours alone, talking to himself or playing with dolls. Servants reported that he would clap his hands for no reason or burst into fits of laughter in empty rooms. Even his rare appearances in public became unsettling. He would mutter under his breath, wave at invisible figures, or suddenly walk away in the middle of an event. Christian VII lived on for decades, but his reign was effectively over. Denmark was ruled by regents while the king lingered as a tragic figure, a man consumed by impulses, betrayed by those closest to him, and ultimately undone by his own mind. It's tempting to dismiss him as just a mad ruler, but his story is more than a cautionary tale about mental illness in monarchy. It's about how unchecked desire, misplaced trust, and the dangerous intimacy of court politics can unravel an entire kingdom. And perhaps the strangest part? To the very end, Christian VII believed he was in control, when in truth, he had been a pawn in his own palace all along. If Christian VII's story was one of desire spiraling into madness, our next king took indulgence to an entirely different level. Where Christian's court whispered behind closed doors, this ruler flaunted his excesses in broad daylight, turning his palace into a stage for debauchery, cruelty, and unrestrained spectacle. And history remembers him not just as a tyrant, but as a man who treated human lives as props in his own twisted theater. There are tyrants. And then there's Henry VIII, a man whose appetites, both political and sexual, were as vast as his kingdom. The image most people remember is the overweight monarch in lavish furs, but the truth is far darker. Behind the portraits was a man who ruled not just his realm, but the bodies, desires, and very lives of his wives with an iron fist and a taste for control that often turned sadistic. Before his decline, Henry was athletic, charming, and, by all accounts, dangerously magnetic. Women at court spoke of his commanding presence, his piercing eyes, and a smile that could melt steel. But the charm was a mask, one he would use to lure women into a gilded cage, one they could never truly escape. Henry's obsession with producing a male heir became the twisted axis of his sex life. In private, he demanded not only loyalty, but complete submission. Accounts from courtiers and foreign ambassadors hinted at a side of Henry few dared to name aloud. A man who treated intimacy as a form of domination, not affection. His wives were required to be available at his command, their bodies instruments in a dynastic experiment where failure meant disgrace or death. Take Catherine of Aragon, his first queen. Married to Henry for over 2 decades, she endured endless cycles of pregnancy and loss, each failure to produce a surviving son met with coldness and blame. Publicly, Henry played the grieving husband. Privately, he began keeping his distance, both emotionally and physically, while parading younger women in front of her. It was less about passion and more about power, humiliating Catherine in front of the entire court. Then came Anne Boleyn, the woman who many say unleashed Henry's most dangerous obsessions. Anne refused him for years, forcing him to chase, to hunger, to burn with frustration. When he finally had her, the thrill began to fade, and Henry's darker impulses took hold. Anne was subjected to constant surveillance, her every gesture and glance noted. Henry's affections were volatile, one day showering her with jewels, the next screaming accusations of betrayal. In the bedroom, rumors swirled of his demands for Anne to please him in ways that, at the time, would have been considered scandalous. Actions whispered about in letters between shock ladies-in-waiting. But Henry's perversions weren't just sexual, they were psychological. He had an uncanny ability to turn intimacy into a weapon. When he tired of Anne, he orchestrated her downfall with a cruelty that still chills historians. Accusations of adultery, incest with her own brother, and treason, all almost certainly fabricated, were enough to send her to the executioner's block. Henry didn't just want her gone. He wanted her shamed, erased, her name forever stained. His third wife, Jane Seymour, offered him the submissiveness he craved. In private, she is said to have been timid, eager to please, but when she finally gave him a son, Edward, she died shortly after childbirth. Henry mourned in his own way. Within weeks, he was already arranging his next marriage, as if Jane had been merely a successful step in a cold-blooded breeding program. By the time he married Anne of Cleves, Henry's appetites had turned crueler and stranger. The infamous story of their wedding night has haunted his legacy. He claimed she was so unattractive to him that he could not consummate the marriage, publicly ridiculing her appearance and calling her the Flanders mare. The humiliation was so severe that it followed Anne for the rest of her life. Then came Catherine Howard, barely a teenager when she caught Henry's eye. She was vivacious, flirtatious, and dangerously young. The age difference was staggering and disturbing. Henry, now a bloated and increasingly ill man in his late 40s, treated her like a prized possession, showering her with gifts and demanding she be the jewel of his court. But Catherine's flirtations with other men, whether real or imagined, ignited Henry's paranoia. In the end, he accused her of treason and adultery, and she was executed at just 19 years old. Reports from her final days suggest she spent hours practicing how to place her head on the block with dignity. His final wife, Catherine Parr, narrowly escaped the same fate. Educated and politically astute, she tried to manage Henry's moods, even nursing him through his declining health. But when she voiced opinions on religion that clashed with his, Henry's temper flared, and he reportedly ordered her arrest. Only quick thinking and tearful submission saved her from the scaffold. Henry's cruelty didn't stop at the bedroom door. His need to dominate extended to public life, where he relished making examples of those who displeased him. Some historians suggest that his sexual desires were intertwined with his love of public spectacle, executions, humiliations, and the breaking of human will. Each marriage became a performance, a rise, a fall, and a final bloody act. Even his closest servants noted how his face would light up at the prospect of control, whether it was a political rival or a wife who had stepped out of line. The boundaries between his sexual appetite and his lust for power blurred until they were one and the same. In the end, Henry VIII left behind a trail of broken bodies and broken spirits. 6 wives, 2 beheaded, 1 divorced in shame, 1 dead from childbirth, and only 1 who survived him. To the world, he was a king. To those who shared his bed, he was a force of fear, a man whose passion could turn to hatred in an instant, and whose kisses might one day be followed by a death warrant. And so, in the royal bedchamber of Henry VIII, desire was never just desire. It was a gamble, with your life as the stake. When King Farouk of Egypt ascended the throne in 1936 at the age of 16, the people saw him as a symbol of youthful promise. He was handsome, charismatic, and carried the hopes of a nation emerging from colonial shadows. But beneath the polished surface, Farouk's reign would unravel into one of the most notorious stories of royal decadence, an almost cartoonish portrait of greed, lust, and appetite that seemed limitless. In less than 2 decades, he would go from Egypt's beloved young king to an overweight, scandal-ridden exile, remembered not for political achievements, but for the outrageous tales of his private life. Farouk's appetites were not limited to the bedroom. They extended to food, luxury, and power in a way that defied comprehension. He reportedly ate 30 eggs for breakfast, followed by mountains of caviar, roasted lamb, and pastries, often washing it all down with champagne. His waistline expanded so quickly that by his mid-20s, the once-fit young monarch had become morbidly obese, struggling to climb the stairs of his own palaces. But it wasn't just food. Farouk had a compulsive need to collect women, cars, jewels, and, oddly enough, other people's possessions. He had a reputation as a kleptomaniac. At diplomatic dinners, he was known to pocket silverware, jewel-encrusted ornaments, or even small paintings. On one famous trip to London, it was alleged that he stole a ceremonial sword from the Shah of Iran's hotel suite. His most bizarre theft. According to British intelligence reports, he once took a priceless pocket watch from Winston Churchill. In the heart of Cairo, Farouk maintained not one, but multiple harems, private apartments filled with a rotating cast of lovers, actresses, models, dancers, aristocratic daughters, even the wives of foreign diplomats. All were rumored to have passed through his gilded chambers. These encounters were not always discreet. Palace servants spoke of nights when the corridors echoed with drunken laughter, the sound of breaking glass, and music blasting until sunrise. Farouk's sexual appetite was legendary, but it was coupled with cruelty and humiliation. Accounts from former companions suggest he enjoyed power games, forcing women to compete for his attention or deliberately pitting them against each other in staged arguments. His tastes grew increasingly theatrical, themed costume parties where women dressed as historical figures, beauty competitions where Farouk acted as the sole judge, and extravagant feasts where naked dancers emerged from enormous decorative cakes. Farouk's first marriage to Queen Farida was a national fairy tale. For about 5 minutes. At 16, she was a picture of innocence, plucked from a noble family and thrust into royal life. The wedding in 1938 was one of the most opulent events in modern Egyptian history, but behind closed doors, the king's wandering eye never rested. Farida endured constant public humiliation as Farouk flaunted mistresses at high society gatherings. His infidelities were so blatant that even the European press, usually careful about royal scandals, ran headlines about the king's affairs. By the early 1940s, Farouk's jealousy and paranoia escalated. He reportedly accused Farida of conspiring against him simply for speaking privately with male courtiers. Yet he himself surrounded his wife with women he had previously bedded, ensuring she could never truly escape the shadow of his affairs. The marriage collapsed in 1948, and Farouk divorced her by royal decree, an act that stunned the Egyptian public, who had adored their queen. Farouk's reign coincided with turbulent geopolitics. World War II, the growing power of nationalist movements, and Britain's waning control over Egypt. Yet while Cairo's streets were full of protests, Farouk seemed more interested in seducing foreign dignitaries' wives than negotiating treaties. He hosted lavish diplomatic dinners that often ended in private after-parties upstairs, where he mixed political discussions with propositions so brazen they made headlines abroad. One particularly infamous rumor claimed that Farouk attempted to seduce the wife of a visiting Middle Eastern monarch during a state visit. When she rejected him, he allegedly ordered her husband's security detail to be accidentally reassigned, giving him a chance to make another advance. Even in moments of national crisis, Farouk's priorities were baffling. During the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, a conflict that saw Egyptian soldiers dying on the battlefield, Farouk spent much of his time yachting along the Mediterranean with showgirls. When his generals requested urgent military supplies, he reportedly delayed shipments because he was hosting an exclusive poker tournament in the palace, and the weapons storage room was being used to hold the expensive imported champagne. By the early 1950s, Farouk's reputation had collapsed. Inflation was soaring, corruption scandals filled the newspapers, and his personal excesses were impossible to hide. Political cartoons depicted him as a bloated figure clutching women in one hand and food in the other, oblivious to his crumbling kingdom. The final straw came in 1952 when the Free Officers movement, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, staged a coup. Farouk fled into exile on his royal yacht, taking with him hundreds of suitcases filled with gold, jewels, and stolen treasures, but leaving behind the monarchy itself, which would be abolished the following year. In exile, Farouk's self-destructive habits continued. He settled in Rome, where he lived in luxury hotels, still surrounded by women and mountains of food. Photographs from the time show him nearly unrecognizable, swollen, sweating, yet still dressed in custom-tailored suits. He became a tabloid curiosity, a fallen king who once ruled one of the most important nations in the Middle East, but was now more famous for his appetite than his crown. He died in 1965 at the age of 45, collapsing at a restaurant table after a massive meal. The official cause was a heart attack, but many Egyptians saw it as poetic justice. The king who devoured everything in sight had finally been consumed by his own excess. Farouk remains one of history's most notorious examples of royal decadence, a man who inherited an ancient throne and used it as a personal playground. His reign is a reminder of how absolute power, unchecked by accountability, can twist into something grotesque. Egypt's last king left behind no monuments, no great political reforms, only a trail of scandal, stolen treasures, and whispered stories of nights that seemed too outrageous to be real. Gilles de Rais, the knight who became a monster. Imagine a man once hailed as a hero, a knight who rode beside Joan of Arc, who fought under the banner of France's liberation, who stood armored in glory as the kingdom celebrated its victories. And yet, behind the gleam of that armor lurked one of the darkest figures history has ever known. His name was Gilles de Rais, and his story is a descent into madness, perversion, and blood. Born into nobility in 1405, Gilles was heir to vast lands and immense wealth. By the age of 25, he had become a celebrated military commander, admired for his courage and loyalty. But power and fortune did not satisfy him. What followed was a spiral that turned one of France's proudest lords into a figure whispered about as a demon in human form. After Joan of Arc was executed, Gilles withdrew from military life. He poured his wealth into grand displays of decadence. Imagine banquets so lavish that guests described golden goblets spilling over, tapestries glittering with silver threads, servants carrying entire roasted beasts. He sponsored plays that lasted for days, hiring hundreds of actors, musicians, and dancers. But while the court marveled at his extravagance, behind closed doors, a nightmare was taking shape. The chronicles tell us that Gilles developed obsessions that grew more and more grotesque. He began summoning children from the villages around his estates, at first under the pretense of service, promising parents opportunities for their sons as pages or singers. But once the gates closed, they never returned. What happened inside those chambers was so disturbing that even hardened inquisitors struggled to put it into words. Testimonies from his servants revealed that Gilles staged horrific rituals. The children were stripped, humiliated, and subjected to torments devised for his pleasure. Some were strangled, others beheaded. Many were killed slowly while Gilles watched with morbid fascination. One account describes how he lingered over their suffering, savoring the expressions of fear as though they dars kursen. Some were performances for his amusement. The number of victims remains uncertain. Some sources speak of dozens, others of hundreds. The trial records suggest over 140 cases, but rumors whispered it could have been many more. What is certain is that the crimes were systematic, repeated, and ritualized. But Gilles' depravity did not end with cruelty to children. He also delved into the occult. Convinced he could summon demons to restore his fading wealth, he hired alchemists and sorcerers. Night after night, black masses were said to be performed in candlelit chambers with strange invocations, incense thick in the air, and Gilles offering the blood of innocents as sacrifice. Whether or not the demons ever answered, his fortune disappeared, squandered on vice, luxury, and perversion. By 1440, whispers had turned into accusations. Local families began demanding answers for their missing children. The church could no longer ignore the rumors. Gilles was arrested, put on trial not only for heresy and occult practices, but for the unspeakable crimes committed against those boys and girls. The trial shocked even seasoned judges. Servants testified in detail. Gilles himself, under pressure, confessed to acts of murder, mutilation, and worse, describing them with a calmness that froze the courtroom. He admitted he derived pleasure not from the sexual act itself, but from the moment of death, the final breath, the struggle, the terror. His execution was swift. On October 26, 1440, Gilles de Rais was hanged and then burned. Some chroniclers noted that crowds wept, not for him, but for the children whose lives he had destroyed. And so ended the life of a man who began as a hero and ended as a monster. A noble knight who fought for France and later preyed on its most innocent. His name remains a warning carved into history, proof that beneath the glitter of power and wealth, the darkest appetites can thrive. A commander who marched with Joan of Arc, remembered not for his victories, but for the perversions that condemned him. a story so disturbing that even 6 centuries later, it still unsettles the imagination. Gilles de Rais, the knight who became a demon in human form. From the golden sands and timeless temples of Egypt, we journey east, across deserts and mountains, until we reach the forbidden city of early 16th century China. Here ruled the Ming dynasty's most unpredictable sovereign, Emperor Zhengde. Crowned at just 14, he inherited not just an empire, but absolute freedom to indulge every whim. Zhengde had little interest in governance. His court chroniclers complained that official meetings were delayed for days because the emperor was busy, teaching his pet leopards to leap through golden hoops. Yes, real leopards, kept in his private chambers alongside an assortment of exotic beasts, tigers, bears, even a giraffe gifted from Africa. The palace began to resemble less a seat of power and more a carnival of dangerous pets, some roaming dangerously close to his servants. But animals were only part of the spectacle. Zhengde transformed sections of the Forbidden City into an elaborate pleasure district, complete with wine shops, banquet halls, and entire streets built inside the palace walls. These streets were populated not with citizens, but with actors and courtesans ordered to play the roles of vendors, gamblers, or thieves, so the emperor could wander incognito through his own miniature city. He would disguise himself as a merchant or soldier, adopt ridiculous aliases like General Zhu or the Duke of Bao, and force his ministers to play along as if they were strangers. To refuse was considered treason. One memorial recorded that he once arrested his own officials during these charades, locking them up overnight simply because it amused him. His pleasures were ruthless as well as extravagant. Zhengde maintained a rotating harem of hundreds of women gathered by imperial decree from across the provinces. Families who resisted often saw their daughters taken by force. The women were trained in dance, music, and theater, but their fate depended entirely on the emperor's mercurial tastes. One moment a girl might be showered in jewels, the next she could be cast aside, never to be summoned again. Even outside his palace, his impulses caused chaos. Bored with luxury, Zhengde led mock campaigns into the countryside, only they were not mock for the peasants who suffered. He commandeered thousands of soldiers, drained the treasury to supply them, and marched out pretending to be on a real war expedition. Villages unlucky enough to fall within his battlegrounds endured looting, forced labor, and destruction. Also, the emperor could act out fantasies of conquest before returning to Beijing in triumph. His recklessness bordered on self-destruction. Drunken hunts in the palace gardens often ended with wounded animals running loose among terrified attendants. During one escapade, Zhengde insisted on riding a tiger as though it were a horse. Predictably, the beast mauled him, leaving scars that he wore like trophies. He treated danger as entertainment, his own mortality just another stage prop. And when his advisors dared to question him, Zhengde silenced them with a single phrase: "I am the son of heaven. What I desire is heaven's will." For Zhengde, the empire was less a realm to govern than a stage upon which he could endlessly improvise his roles: warrior, merchant, libertine, beast tamer. His reign was one of silks, perfumes, and games of power played like theater. But beneath the laughter and spectacle lay fear, exhaustion, and a government drifting into chaos. And while some emperors feared assassination, Zhengde feared only boredom. When the curtain finally fell on Zhengde's life, there was no heroic ending. He died suddenly at the age of 29 after falling into a lake while drunk and contracting illness. No children, no legacy, only stories of leopard cages, false generals, and women forgotten in the shadows of his palace. His empire survived him, but his reign endures as a warning. that even the Middle Kingdom itself could be shaken not by armies, but by the reckless heart of its own Son of Heaven. And with that, we close tonight's journey into the shadows of history. These stories remind us that the past is never silent. It whispers, it warns, and it lingers. If you enjoyed wandering through these forgotten halls with me, don't forget to subscribe and join us again. Until next time, may your night be quiet, your thoughts restless, and your dreams touched by history's echoes.